Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this special Food Climate Thinkers event. That's a topical twist on our regular Food Thinkers series here at the Centre for Food Policy at City, University of London. Our session is pegged this evening, obviously, to the UN Conference on Climate Change, which is now drawing to a close in Glasgow. And our topic this evening is the critically important connection between climate change and the food system. The Food Thinkers seminars generally highlight big ideas for redesigning food systems. And this year, we've been showcasing the work of women with big ideas for the food system from academia, policy, business, and advocacy. And we followed that practice this evening. I'm Lindy Sharp, and I'm the director of the Food Research Collaboration here at the Centre for Food Policy. The Food Research Collaboration aims to bring together academic and civil society knowledge, make it mutually useful and available to policymakers in order to drive progress towards a more sustainable food system. And climate change has obviously been central to that work for a long time, which is why I'm delighted to host this evening's discussion. The title of our talk is There Food on the Table at COP26? And we have two highly qualified speakers to discuss that. But just before I introduce them, there are a few housekeeping notes to mention. First of all, if you would like to receive the Centre for Food Policy's monthly newsletters, you can sign up for the mailing list. If you just put Centre for Food Policy mailing list into Google, you will get a nice sign-up form. I'd also like to tell you that applications are now open for next year's Masters in Food Policy and the new exciting bachelor's degree, BSc, in Nutrition and Food Policy, delivered here at City, University of London. And you can find details of both of them on the website. If you'd like to find out more about Food Research Collaboration, which I hope you do, please visit our website, foodresearch.org.uk, and sign up for our newsletter, which will tell you all about our activities and our publications, which will tomorrow include a blog by one of this evening's presenters about her research. I should tell you that this webinar is being recorded, and an edited version will be made available online afterwards via the Centre for Food Policy's YouTube channel. If you have questions, which I'm sure you will have, please write them into the Q&A box, not the chat box. We will collect them. Our running order this evening is we'll have the two presentations and then we'll have questions for both the panelists. So please write your questions as they occur to you, saying who you want to ask, and we'll collect them. And don't worry if it looks as if you're the only person asking questions. You're not. That's just a quirk of the technology. If you'd like to tweet, please do that using the hashtag FoodThinkers and the handles at Food Policy City or at Food Research UK. And finally, I would like to flag our next Food Thinkers webinar, which will be on Wednesday, the 8th of December, when Priya Fielding Singh of Stanford University will be talking about her forthcoming book, How the Other Half Eats, the Untold Story of Food and Inequality in America, which sounds very interesting, I must say. So that's the housekeeping notices. We now move to the substance of the evening, and it is my real great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Paula Feehan and Dr. Tara Garnett. I'll introduce Paula now, and then after Paula's finished her presentation, I'll pop back in and introduce Tara. So our first presenter is Paula Feehan, and we are proud to say she's one of our students. She's just finished working for her master's degree. Like many of our master's students who have very diverse backgrounds and work experience, Paula came to us with an interesting past. She worked for two big development charities, Oxfam and ActionAid, in the UK and New Zealand and Australia on campaign and strategy work. This evening, based on the research she did for her master's dissertation here at City, she's going to tell us what she found out when she started looking to see whether food consumption, diet, was included in the action plans, the NDCs, that countries presented in advance at this year's COP26. Paula.
This quote sparked my interest, the premise from which my research started. If we do not include the food system, we're not going to reach our climate targets. In climate conversations, we hear a lot about fossil fuels, about energy, about transport, about buildings. We hear comparatively little about the food we produce and even less about the food that we eat. And that's an important distinction. The food we currently produce, and in particular meat and dairy, are by far the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our collective diet. But the food we produce is the food we consume, our diet. Food production and food consumption need to be factored into climate policies. The conversation about food needs to be more holistic. We need to not only look at how we produce food, but what type of food we produce and what we eat. Or in other words, it seems that something very important is missing from the climate conversation, our diet. Hi, my name is Paula Feehan, and I am delighted to be sharing my research on dietary change and the nationally determined contributions submitted by countries leading up to COP26. Over the next 15 minutes, I'll be sharing with you why it's interesting, what I found, and some thoughts on how we can include diet going forward. Before I start, I wanted to say a big thank you to the Centre for Food Policy for allowing me this opportunity. Thank you. Evidence of animal agriculture's impact on the climate and the potential of reducing meat and dairy to address climate change has been growing over the last 15 years. This slide is a whistle-stop tour of some of the key reports from 2006 to present day. These reports made the connection. The growing demand for meat and dairy is increasing the number of animals farmed and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. And here are some policy recommendations from a small selection of those reports. The UN agency, Food and Agriculture Organization, way back in 2006, produced Livestock's Long Shadow. This was one of the first international reports to confirm the connection between animal agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the body of the world's leading climate experts, in 2009 described plant-based diets as a major opportunity for mitigating and adapting to climate change, and included for the first time a policy recommending reducing meat consumption. A policy recommendation about reducing meat from the IPC is big news. Last year, the UK Climate Change Commission, the independent body which advises the UK government on climate policy, stated that large-scale shifts in diet could play an important role in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions and help to achieve the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. But how has all this evidence from a wide variety of sources, from multilateral institutions, climate scientists, and academics, been integrated into climate policies? Historically, dietary choices have not been as central as these reports would suggest. Policymakers have historically shied away from talking about changing what we eat. Evidence of this is in the first climate plan submitted after the 2015 Paris Agreement. Only 5 countries prioritised animal agriculture as a focus for climate mitigation. And in these 5, changes to production methods were highlighted, not dietary change. So I wanted to explore, had climate policies leading up to this important meeting integrated the evidence that reducing meat and dairy is a powerful tool to mitigate climate change? Would the seriousness of the climate emergency mean that finally dietary change was included? To explore this further, I chose nationally determined contributions. You may have heard these being discussed at COP26. These represent a country's climate domestic plans. They are submitted to the United Nations as agreed under the terms of the 2015 Paris Agreement. There is a public record of the plan, and they are reviewed every 5 years. And countries were submitting updated NDCs leading up to this meeting in November. The NDCs were being updated in real time. There are over 190 countries who are signatories to the Paris Agreement. I focused on the countries that were among the top 20 producers or consumers of meat and dairy, and they were also members of the G20. And an important point about this research is that the focus is on G20, not the developing world, where small-scale agricultural farming plays a critical role in food security. And secondly, the global south is not responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions. That's the G20, who, according to the UN, these 20 countries are responsible for a staggering 78% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So who made the cut? Well, now, New Zealand, as you probably know, is not in the G20, but it was included as it is one of the top 20 producers of dairy and the top 20 consumer of meat. To analyse the NDCs, I used a thematic analysis to explore their content. This included what words were included or not included in the NDC. Was funding provided for dietary change? How did countries talk about their NDC in the media? Was there any evidence of land use change away from intensive animal agriculture? So what did I find? Well, of the 9, 6 NDCs made no reference to food, diet, consumption, meat, or dairy as part of their climate mitigation strategy. No NDCs referenced the provision of funding for dietary change. Press releases most frequently mention emission reduction through technology, changes to agricultural production methods, and all through the lens of continued economic growth. None identified decreasing animal agriculture or increasing plant-based agriculture. 2 countries did mention dietary change. The UK. The UK referenced a national shift to healthy diets supported by a sustainable food system. Mexico referenced promoting sustainable production and consumption practices, but no mention of meat or dairy, no funding for dietary change, no mention of change of land use, and no plans on how they were going to achieve this. NDCs in policy, words in policy often represent binaries. It's either an A problem or a B problem. 3 recurring binaries were identified within the NDC. 7 of the 9 NDCs represented climate change as a food production problem, not food consumption. All NDCs represented climate change as one that could be solved through technological solutions, not systemic change. And 8 out of 9 focused on changes in how we grow food, not what we grow. Policies are also filled with concepts that drive how policymakers see the world. In the NDCs, 5 key concepts were present about how climate change will be resolved. Firstly, and again, technology. The concept that technology will solve climate change. Climate change does not require a transformation of the food system, but is about technology enabling sustainable production, not sustainable food. On-farm improvements will be the solution, changing how animals are farmed. Continued economic growth, there it is again. Behaviour change was also mentioned, how individuals behave across all sectors of the economy, economy-wide. Energy, transport and heating was mentioned. However, 7 of the 9 were silent on behaviour change relating to diet. I also had the privilege of interviewing people who were involved with the development of their country's NDCs, policymakers, policy advisors, and policy influencers. This provided an insight into what lay beneath the content of the NDCs to get a sense of assumptions, belief systems, and the all-important power relations that lay behind whether and how diet was represented in NDCs. 3 themes emerged from the interviews about the lack of inclusion. Firstly, the perceived power of the agricultural sector, power to influence policy, power to lobby against climate change policy, including diet, power to frame the issue in the public sphere that animal agriculture is green friendly. perceptions about political will to discuss diet. Interviewees believed it was politically challenging for politicians to discuss what people should eat, that it could prove unpopular with constituency and would antagonize the agriculture industry. And thirdly, and very importantly, individuals and dietary change. This followed a libertarian position of people's freedom to choose. Talking about diet is seen as an unwarranted intervention by the state, or as one interviewee put it, get your hands off my burger. So what does this tell us about why these did not include diet? All these assumptions, belief systems, and power dynamics could be said to amount to a vicious cycle of inaction. They describe an alliance of interests that prevent an open discussion of the role of dietary change in NDCs. The cycle includes the agriculture industry exercising various forms of power to affect outcomes, influence content of policies, and control the narrative about dietary change. In turn, governments are wary of challenging the sector and being seen to infringe people's rights to make their own diet and lifestyle choices. Without strong messaging from industry or government, individuals feel less accountable for climate change in their own choices and lack access to reliable information about the impacts of these choices and possible trade-offs. So, the all-important question, how could this be changed? To reduce the harm caused to our climate by the current food system, people need to consume less meat and dairy, especially in G20 countries. What levers will bring change to this vicious cycle of inaction? Here are 3 required interventions. Firstly, the current role of the state needs to change. Governments should stop being so passive and have the courage to talk directly about individuals' consumption. As I shared at the beginning, we are not going to achieve limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade if we do not include the entire food system, which includes diet. If governments reframe the issue and convey the climate, environmental, and public health benefits arising from dietary change, this could create political consensus to support government interventions. I admit, awareness raising alone is only part of the solution, but it will be crucial for creating the conditions for effective policy. Second, demand links to supply. Therefore, there needs to be a change in agricultural policy. We need better regulation of the agricultural sector with requirements to account for and report on emissions. And secondly, as the UN and FAO recommend, public subsidies repurposed to support a just transition for farmers to transition to more sustainable production. And thirdly, the current siloed representation of the food system should be replaced with a food system approach, an approach which acknowledges that consumption drives the shape and design of production systems, the simple and eternal relationship between supply and demand. This would support a more coordinated strategy across international and national climate policies that recognise the link between diet, environment, and health. So I'll leave you today with how I believe dietary change could be integrated into NDCs. The vicious cycle could be replaced with a virtuous cycle of action. It starts with policies by the government to build awareness of the co-benefits of dietary change, which would build a mandate for policy change towards the agriculture sector, enabling a more coherent view of the food system and providing the opportunity for inclusion of diet and NDCs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Paula. That was amazing, amazingly interesting. Thank you so much. I think these thematic analysis of what policies actually say are really interesting. And I think you shed light on something quite technical, but a really sort of dark corner that needs to be in the light. So thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Please save your questions and put them into the Q&A and we'll ask them all at the end. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Tara Garnett, who is at the organisation table and is based at Oxford University. Tara is someone I greatly admire for her intellect, for the clarity of her writing, and for the humanity that she also always brings to that writing, even on the most divisive issues, and perhaps particularly on the most divisive issues in food. In the UK, without a shadow of a doubt, she led the way in highlighting the links between food and climate change, having 25 years ago set up what was then a rather niche NGO, the Food Climate Research Network, to explore these connections. She's now the director of Table, which is a global platform for sharing knowledge and dialogue on food systems and the future of food, the broad canvas. I invited Tara to speak this evening because, for me, she has thought as much as anyone about the interdependencies between how we eat and how we live on the earth, what the food system's done, how it has to change, whether it can change, and whether we can change. Tara, I think, is going to share her reflections and uncertainties on her own journey through these organizations that she has founded and through this very difficult but ever more pressing issue. Tara.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it now? Great. My internet just dropped out just a little bit through Paula's presentation, so I hope it's going to hold. So thank you, Lindy, for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. Lindy more or less said I said, what would you like me to talk about? And she said, well, whatever you like. And I said, well, I've given a lot of talks about food and climate change over the years, and I think there are a lot of people who are very, very well equipped to talk about food and climate change now. Can I do something a little bit different? She said, yes, fine. So I'm not really going to talk about climate change, although hopefully everything I talk about will be relevant to food and its interactions with climate. And I hope I can make that a little bit clear as I go along. I'm going to talk about how I see discussions and thinking and problems relating to food and food systems, how they have evolved over the course of my time working in this field. And it's going to be necessarily quite a personal overview, because the way you see how things are and how things develop is very much framed by, you know, where you sit in the world and looking out through your own eyes. So I'm going to start in the early days, and it's quite fitting that I'm giving a talk to the Centre for Food Policy, because that was set up by Tim Lang, and many of you who are listening to this talk will be doing your masters at City, and in that sense you will be the children of Tim Lang's vision and far-sighted thinking, and I am as well, because I started, you know, back in the late 1980s, armed only with an English degree and a master's in international development and some vague sense that I somehow wanted to help save the world. And I ended up doing some volunteering for what was then called the National Food Alliance, where I did some work. I did some work that was looking at the role of urban food growing in contributing to a range of social, environmental, and health benefits. And in the end, the National Food Alliance merged with the then Safe Alliance to become Sustain, which is now, in the best possible sense, a bit of a revolving door with City University, that I know that many people go on to do internships or even get jobs at Sustain, and that's where I came from as well. So back at that time, I was doing work looking at urban food growing and its potential, but also at that time Sustain's the Food Miles report that had been published by the Safe Alliance was published, and that highlighted the dangers of long distance transport, as it put it, and it looked at food miles as the arteries of globalization and all the ills attendant on that. And I found it an absolutely fascinating and inspiring report. But through a pile of conversations that I was having with various people, including at the Department of Transport, people say, well, hang on a minute, is shorter necessarily better? What exactly is the relationship between food, transport, and greenhouse gas emissions? And so I went off, and by that time I was working for a different organization, an environmental transport charity, to look at that relationship between food and transport and CO2, and came to the conclusion that it was actually quite complex, and that the big revelatory thing that I learned along the way was that food's contribution to emissions extended well beyond its transport stage and along the whole of the supply chain, and that this was really significant, but nobody was talking about it. So that gave me the inspiration for setting up the Food Climate Research Network, and I did it by joining the University of Surrey, which helped me put that together. So the purpose of the Food Climate Research Network was to look at that food climate connection. And very, very quickly, it became apparent that if you're talking about food and its contribution to emissions, you have to be talking about consumption, because as Paul has pointed out, we produce what we produce because we consume what we consume, and of course vice versa as well. So we needed to look at the consumption side of things. And of course, once you start looking at the consumption side of things, you have to look at the interface between with our diets and with our health. And of course, when you're looking at production and indeed the whole of the supply chain, you're having also to think about the connections between food and climate and a whole range of other social, ethical, and environmental concerns, especially when it becomes the meat issue, which uses so much land and which has all these animal ethics dimensions as well to think about. And then you've got the jobs and the livelihoods. So there's a whole enmeshment of different other issues. So it's impossible to actually talk about food and climate separately from these other things. And of course, once you start talking about all these issues, you start to talk about, well, we have a problem. How are we going to change? And that brings in issues of power, justice, and responsibility. And of course, then you have to bring in the sort of work that, for example, Corinna Hawkes has done so very, very well over the years about the fact that you can't talk about production at one end and consumption at the other, since the critical thing is also the transformation of food from, wheat through to, sourdough bread or donuts. So we have to look at that piece, and that, of course, also brings in ideas of power and corporate concentration. So we get to a stage where you're stopping talking about a supply chain, which implies a kind of push food out sort of approach to things, talking about value chains, which brings in all the other dimensions of food and provisioning and the people involved, to be talking about food systems, which is all about a network, a webwork of people and things and processes and impacts. But the more I sort of was knocking about the kind of the food world and talking to people, what I got was a sense that there was a real urgency, a sense that there were lots and lots of problems, but that what constitutes a solution very much depends on where people are coming from and what their starting points are, and what their visions of good really looks like. And that if we cannot talk just about the science, we have to also talk about people's ideas of what the real problems are and what solutions actually look like. And that's what has led to the formation of Table. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So that's a bit of background. And I think where we are today, I think there's goods and bads. So we have some recognition that the food system is a system, or it's a set of systems. It's really crowded now from where it was when I first started. There's loads and loads of organizations, loads of academic analyses, loads of strategies, quite a lot of greenwash as well. loads of recommendations, and that is a good thing. I mean, I think it's great. It's a crowded field, and it's right that it should be, but I still don't see this unity of approach. I see lots of inertia, and I also see more polarization than ever before. And I think here's just some kind of very, very well-known examples. We had the UN Food Systems Summit, which was incredibly polarized, incredibly contested. We have all these just endless discussions about eating meat, not eating meat, whether veganism is a good thing or a bad thing, and people come at it from all these different angles. You know, GMO is going to save the world. No, GMO is not going to save the world, and agroecology is going to save the world. And then I think I've got my screen a bit in the way. We've got all this rise in plant-based alternatives, and that leads to a whole other set of debates. So we have these very, very black and white sets of debates. So I'm finding that the certainties become more uncertain and they become more disputed. And to take as an example here, I get asked a lot of the time, as do many of you, what should we eat to be healthy and sustainable? So here's an example of this contestation. This is what I have said for a long time, and it's nothing very, very earth-shattering. You'll see a lot of this sort of stuff out here. Don't eat more than you need, eat a diversity of foods, eat more plants and less meat, fewer dairy products, don't eat junk, don't waste food. And I'll add question normal, and I'll come on to that. And all this is quite conventional advice within the food world, but at the same time, it's very contested and contestable. And to give some examples here, so the don't eat more than you need. I mean, what does that actually mean? Does it mean that that you have to eat foods that maximize nutrition for calories? Does it mean don't eat more calories than you need, more resource intensive food than you need? What about the energy out as well as the energy inside of the occasion? What about all the social and the cultural dimensions of food? What about the link between food insecurity and hoarding and binging and obesity and associated eating disorders? What about the fat stigma that we see in society? How can you actually say that sort of thing? And then there's discussions about, well, eat a diversity of foods, but what do we actually mean by diversity? I take it, you know, we don't mean Oreos and donuts and chips, but at the same time, are we talking about diversity across classes of fruits and vegetables? Are we talking varieties of localized fruits and vegetables? So I'm giving examples here of different kinds of fruits, and then very specific kinds of apples. So it's what we mean by diversity that is also up for grabs. And then eat more plants and eat less meat. But what kind of meat do we eat? Is it beef that's bad, or is it poultry that's bad? What about the production method? What about the relationship with health? Does eat less meat mean none at all? And if you don't eat meat, what else are you going to eat? And what about the environmental impacts of the alternatives? And so on and so forth. And then discussions about don't eat junk. Well, that's sensible at the one hand, but it's riddled with class and value and cultural judgments on the other. And then what happens when you start morally categorizing foods and talking about sin taxes, where is that, firstly, is that helpful? And secondly, what is your kind of educational and class position that you're coming at from on these subjects? And then questions about wasting food, you know, don't waste food. We always hear that, and yes, very true. But we also know that within the food system, too much efficiency can lead to increased vulnerability, and that you need a little bit of a slack in the system, in which case, how much? And how do we define food waste? Some people would define feeding grains to animals as food waste. Other people would say, well, you're getting something that's we want to eat out of, you know, and you're bulking out the grass that they're eating as well, and you're getting more value for money for it. or we see people who are using food waste, spent bread that is being used to produce beer. Is that better than using spent bread as an animal feed? These are value judgments here. And then we've got the rebound effect. If you're diverting waste streams into new products and new product innovations, you might actually simply be increasing what it is that we are producing and therefore consuming, rather than actually saving waste. And then if I save money by wasting less food, am I just going to buy myself a new, I don't know, iPod or a new pair of shoes? And what will be the environmental consequences of that? And then finally, the question normal issue. What I meant by that is that we need to consider the kind of cultural norms and preferences and take them for granted in how we eat, and the extent to which they perpetuate very high impact ways of thinking. But I think what you could also kick back on that is say that, well, then whose truths am I going to follow? Who am I going to believe or get into bed with now? So I think there are all sorts of questions that we need to think about, even when it comes to the certainties that we thought we had. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that we all want a sustainable food future. And here's my very cheesy photograph of us all going into the sunset. But I don't know what that actually means. Because I don't know what we really talk about when we talk about food. At one level, we talk about things like climate change and social justice and nutrition and all these big problems that we face. And then at the other end, we talk about these argued approaches and ways forward, whether it be agroecology, whether it be taxing things, whether it be in more public procurement, better public procurement policies, investing in better education and awareness raising, whatever it might be. But underlying those things, what do we really talk about when we talk about food? And I think that's what I want to come on to, because I think we talk about these things. I think we talk about what's really to blame, who has agency and responsibility, how we define the distinction between greed and need, what we mean by freedom, how we navigate this relationship between the natural and the cultural world. I think we talk about numbers and ways of knowing. And I think we talk about what's desirable and what's actually possible. And those sound very, very abstract. But I think as I go on, I think you'll recognize that this is indeed at the core of many, many of the debates we are having at the moment around food, climate change, and that wider nexus of concern. So to take questions of what we talk about, the ideas about causes and blame. So for some stakeholders, the root cause of our environmental problems is that we haven't yet got quite clever enough, that the problems are a failure of innovation, a failure of technology, a failure of ingenuity. So the solution that we need is simply to get cleverer, invest more in technology and in these so-called game-changing solutions. That's one approach. Another approach is to say, actually, the real root cause of our problems is that we're just too greedy and that we somehow need to be saved from ourselves. Either we need to be persuaded to become better people, or we need to be regulated so that we're forced to be better. And for other people, it's neither one nor the other. It's a problem of social justice. It's a problem of inequality, and that what we need is to transform the economic systems and structures within which the food system operates. So that's one set of discussions that we're having. And then we have these discussions about agency and responsibility. So, you know, on the that diagram there is the obesity map. So there's one sense that we have this fantastically complicated system, and that we are somehow all part of that system. So how do we think about this? So one theory of how we are and how we operate in relation to the food system at its extreme is that we are all mindless zombies in thrall to the machinations of big business. At the other extreme, you could say that, you know, we are all personally responsible for how we eat and how we act, and that if we're fat, we're lazy and it's all our fault, and that we have this kind of moral duty to take care of our health and take care of our planet as individuals. And that leads to thinking of us as consumers. Another way of thinking of us and as responsible agents is as citizens who do things like campaign and write to their MPs and go on marches and agitate for change in civic spaces. So all these different ways of thinking about what the system is and what the levers of change, who the agents who are responsible within the system. And I think we see these debates in the theories of change that different organizations put out. And then we have lots and lots of discussions about need and greed, and a lot of it focuses on meat. You see a lot of discussions about that and about ultra processed foods. We have fewer discussions about things like alcohol and its contribution to environmental impacts as so-called unnecessary foods that a lot of us enjoy and consume. But some foods get categorized as really bad and somehow morally problematic, and other foods less so. And I think there's a lot of sort of I think we need to sit back and reflect upon that somehow, how we categorize things. I'm just thinking, you know, almonds, some people say, oh, well, they're plant-based foods, so they're fine. Other people will say, oh, pesticides, bees, water, you know, so are these also unnecessary foods? I'm including a picture of my cat there, who's looking exceptionally stupid, just to say that I have a cat. I don't need to have a cat. He gives me a lot of pleasure. I feed him meat products. That is part of my carbon footprint. I go swimming in my local Lido, which is slightly heated, and I don't need to do that. Is that a greedy thing to do insofar as I'm contributing to unnecessary energy use? So I'm just thinking about how, as societies, we navigate this divide between need and greed. And I think they riddle the conversations we have about food, and different people judge and moralize in different ways. And I think that causes a lot of the disagreement. And then these discussions about freedom. And so classically, we have this debate about, you know, is it freedom to consume, to have, you know, choice of 50 different brands of cereal, or is it freedom from consumption, living the good life, the simple life, the frugal life? But I think those binaries are complicated by the fact that there's more to freedom. There's also the freedom of self-determination. And here I have a picture of Eve, who simply would not do what she was told. She ate that apple. And I think sometimes we need to move beyond those binaries and think about how we as humans also want to kind of radically imagine new possibilities, new ways of thinking, to dare to think and to explore new ways of living. And I think they don't sit, that mindset doesn't sit very neatly into this freedom to or freedom from divide that I hear a lot in discussions about what we need and what we want. And then the old debates about nature and culture, so that we need to work with nature and go back to the landscapes we have lost. But I guess the question is, which landscape and when's nature? So, you know, this is map of, you know, European land cover over the last 1,000 years. So are we going to go back to, you know, round about the time of the agricultural revolution, or should we go back further still? Should we go back to the Paleolithic? Your idea of what good nature is very much informed by the sort of baseline that you keep in your head, and different ideas of how we fit in nature. So for some people, a kind of working with nature approach is the way forward, that we need to somehow integrate humanity into the natural world through, for example, agroecological approaches. For others, it's about trying to get out of nature, let nature get on with its thing so that we don't damage it anymore. And that might give rise to more intensive or alternative systems of food provisioning. And I think we also have to think about whose idea of nature is, whose idea of wilderness is it, and also who owns nature. That's another thing. And then there is a lot of assumption within the environmental movement that we need to somehow work with nature, but a lot of the time we don't seem to want to work with nature. You know, with contraception and with vaccines, we may have risks associated with those technologies, but on the whole, these are risks that society is willing to make because they feel that the benefits outweigh the defects. And then I think, you know, linking back, we have the same sorts of discussions about culture and about loss of culture and so on and so forth today. And so I just thought I'd show, whenever I make spanakopiters, I have Greek background, Cypriot background, and I make them now and then. And every time I make them, because, you know, my family likes them, I slightly feel like an enslaved woman. I shouldn't, but somehow I think, what if I was one of these people who all they were supposed to be doing is producing delicious food for their family because you're a woman and that's what you do. So I take the spanakopiters because they're tasty and they're nice, but I don't want to feel like an enslaved woman. We sort of pick and mix our culture a bit. So I think we have to be aware of our assumptions and our inconsistencies in many respects. And I think those feed very much into discussions about what sorts of food systems we want, what sorts of agriculture we want, what sorts of food culture we want. And then there's ideas about metrics and ways of knowing. And I think there's huge debates here about whose knowledge actually counts. So are we talking about the top-down agricultural models, climate models at one level, but then there are people who say, well, my lived experience, my local experience counts for more when it comes to my context than these very generalized models. And the same in case of life cycle assessments and carbon footprinting. You have these big picture assessments of the role of meat in comparison to other foods, but then you will have kickback from that to say that, yes, but this isn't necessarily true of here in this context, given the other multiple different outputs of livestock production. And then, for example, we have different ways of thinking about nutrition. So at one level, you've got these chips that look, you know, they look pretty good from a food labeling point of view. There's lots of greens and only a little bit of orange for the salt. Is this a healthy food? Well, someone like Georgie Skrinis, who's done a lot of work on nutritionism, says that this is a very, very reductive way of thinking about food and nutrition because it fails to take into account the kind of the power structures inherent in that very sort of processed and convenience orientated delivery mechanism for food. So I think people come at questions of knowledge and the validity of different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of metrics when assessing the harms and benefits of different aspects of the food system. They come at it in very, very different ways. And it's very, very difficult to know how you unite that top-down and bottom-up perspective, that essential reductionism on the one hand, and the need for a more holistic, interconnected way of knowing on the other. And you know, I don't have an answer to it, but I think we have a lot of the debate is essentially, it's about knowledge wars. It's about whose knowledge counts. And then we have these discussions about utopias and theories of change. When people advocate for ways forward, are they advocating for their best possible future or a kind of realistic, pragmatic, this is going to be better than the alternative way forward? Are we going to go for the quick but safe wins, or for possibly unrealistic but much, much more radical change? What about lock-in and moral hazard? Going down one route where might it get you? And I'm quite minded of the recent global methane pledge, which is for getting emissions down, and the animal feed industry is all behind it, because they feel that supplements and genetics and so forth will enable them to get that methane down while maintaining the existing industrialized intensive livestock status quo. So again, it's a kind of, where do strategies lead to? What directions do they actually lead to? Do we encourage change by tapping into people's intrinsic motivations to do the right thing, or their more extrinsic, seeking approval, seeking validation from external sources, like making things cool and aspirational? Do we go from theories of change that focus on top-down actions or bottom-up mass movements? Are we going to be bold? Are we going to be cautious? Should we put in place measures today, or wait a bit and just bet on the fact that in the future we'll come up with some kind of technological miracle? I think all these theories of change, differences there, also drive some of the debates around food. So given that complexity, how on earth do you make policy? And also given that complexity, who is the you in all this? Where is the agent? And I don't really know. That's my very, very short and unhelpful answer, because it is so difficult, because you're dealing not only with science, but also with the much, much more important, I would say, aspects of values and ethics and policies. But the kind of slightly longer and answer to how is to have conversations and to think and talk and reflect and be self-critical about your own assumptions and views, and be more open-minded about the views of people with whom you disagree. And I think that somewhat sort of hippy-dippy perspective on things has also given rise to the rationale for setting up Table, because I think what we're trying to do is encourage more open discussions about questions like the above. But we go on this assumption that scientific knowledge is necessary, but not in itself sufficient, because it can't tell us what a good food system looks like, because it will look different for you and you and you and you. Everyone will have a slightly different vision of what that good is, and that I think we need to be more open in exploring those values through more inclusive discussions. So that's essentially what Table is trying to do, and we try and do it through a range of written outputs and through organising events, but also by trying to provide a platform for dialogue and constructive discussion. So these are some of our outputs. They're all on our website, and so please do take a look. I'm going to finish by answering one really unfair question that Lindy put to me. She said, Tara, what I would like you to talk about is to give people some of your reflections on what to do with the fact that the world is falling apart, and how do you or I personally cope with this. It's really, really unfair question. And it's also quite a personal question. And I will do my best to answer it, but I'm not really in a position to offer any words of wisdom, because of course, I do get depressed and very sad about things. But at the same time, I mean, there's lots of ways of addressing this. So one is that it feels like end times, but it's also worth pointing out that there have been many past end times as well, many past visions of the world being about to fall apart and the world being about to end, and somehow we've struggled through. And of course you can say, well, this time it's really different, and of course in the past I guess they always felt that this time it's really different. So I don't know. I mean, there is a historical context even to despair, and of course the world is falling apart. We see that in many other aspects, not just in terms of climate change, but at the same time, the world is extraordinary, and there have been massive progress and benefits, and there is such a diversity of wonderful people and wonderful activities and ideas, and there's been huge progress. So the world is never one thing, is it? There's never a single truth. You can't get a pair of scales and say, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand, because things are not commensurable in many ways. So I think that's one answer. The other answer to the world is falling apart, how do I cope? I would say that a lot of the time, like most people, I spend it, you know, worrying about my kids, worrying about that stupid thing I said the other day to someone. So, you know, people's individual pressing little problems also often overtake big existential problems. I think, obviously, you know, like everyone else, I have my own interests, my own activities. I go off and I watch the latest Bond movie, just as if nothing was happening. And then it's a question of what can you do? So that was the other question she asked me. And I think you do what you can within the limitations of your personality. And we all have our limitations, you know, and tendencies and interests. And some people, you know, they're very campaigny. Some people want to get into policy. Some people are very bookish and like to kind of sit and read and think. And you work with your personality and try and do what you can. So that's it for kind of wisdom according to Tara Garnett. And I think that's it for my presentation. So thank you very much. Okay.
Tara, what can I say? That was amazing. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I asked you an unfair question.
Have I stopped sharing? No, I haven't.
Okay, yes,
no,
stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yes, well, you are a corrective to me, because I have sometimes reached a position on the same journey of thinking it's just all these human issues. We've got to forget them, sort out the technical climate problem, and then we will be able to have an arena to sort out these other questions which humanity has been arguing about since the dawn of time. But of course, that's never going to happen. We're never going to be able to do that. All the things that you said are absolutely right. I take cheer from the fact that you say we all just have to do what we can. Now, we've got a lot of questions which we're going to try and get through. I'd like to thank you most sincerely for your wonderful presentation. Paula, can you put your camera back on? Hi, Paula, welcome back. So we've had a question about something that seems straightforward. We had a presentation about something that, you know, we have a lot of evidence about this. Why aren't we taking action about this? And then we've had this exploration of the real uncertainties in this whole issue that lead into kind of some very existential uncertainties about other issues as well. So I'm going to fire some questions at you. And the first question is from Bill Grace, and it's a very specific question for you, Paula. And it says, do you think that the UK government's move to use public money only to reward farmers for delivering public goods is an appropriate policy switch? Do you think that will support the agenda you're seeking?
Great question. And I think it comes back to, actually, Lindy, something that you said. You really need to get into the detail of policies to see what's really going on with them. And that policy that I think that you're talking about is a move in the UK to move to environment land management. And so currently, at the moment, UK farmers receive £3.5 billion a year. And they're moving to more environment land management, where farmers will be rewarded for public goods. Now, the key thing about this is that public goods within this, the legal definition is for this act is the first tier is all about prioritising environmental practices. They'll be rewarded if they do actions to improve biodiversity. And thirdly, they'll be rewarded on change projects with regards to forest restoration, etc. But do you know what public good isn't defined? It's about what they actually do with the land in terms of growing food. So there's nothing about food production with regards to it being a public good. So it misses out food as a public in its relationship to public health, food as in terms of nutrition. So I think it's if you hear that, you think, oh, okay, that sounds good. Yes, public good, how we use land. But again, the food conversation is missing. Consumption, about what we do with the land, what we grow on the land, and what we eat. So I think it needs some more work, if I'm honest.
Okay, I have a question next from Rachel for Tara, who says she really appreciates the way your work deals with motivations and worldviews, and she loved your discussion of polarization just now. And she notes that you yourself have ironically become the target of some polarized views, and she's now seen you characterized as a vegan activist. She says, would you be willing to share any thoughts about that? And do you also get criticism from the industrial ag side? Do you get criticized from all directions?
Yeah. I'm also, yes, I'm not a vegan as well. But I mean, I think I do get these, and I don't really know what to say. I think you really want to engage people in discussion and try and have open discussions and debates, and sometimes it just isn't going to happen because people are going to see what they see and not going to change their mind. I think when we wrote the Grazed and Confused report, which was looking at the extent to which livestock can contribute to soil carbon sequestration, and it came to the conclusion that the benefits were limited, and I think I got also very attacked by certain quarters of the environmental movement who somehow felt that we were therefore supporting more industrialized livestock production. And again, it's this idea that if you're not one thing, then you're somehow in the other camp. And it's very deep rooted in people's way of thinking, if not this, then that, and trying to find a more kind of, I don't want to use the word grey because that sounds very boring, that kind of richer color palette, to sort of see that things can be more complex, I think it's just very difficult, and yeah, sometimes it gets a bit personal.
Something that interests me is that in that polarized debate, and a lot of the questions here reflect it, is about the environmental impacts of animal consumption versus plant consumption, but they don't really see it from the animal's perspective. I mean, the animal welfare, euphemistically called, position is not as well articulated. Why do you think that is?
I agree. I think that's changed. I think a lot of the older discussions about animals were indeed from an animal rights perspective, and I think the environment has sort of trumped that recently, and I think that's just gone hand in hand with kind of more. I think maybe, and this is really speculative, that animal rights was considered either for people who are somehow extremists, or kind of fluffy donkey lovers, and therefore a bit batty sort of thing, but that the environment is a credible movement to join, and that therefore there is a position there to take on livestock that doesn't kind of expose you to those forms of kind of insult. Yes,
that's a very good point. Paula, there's another one here for you from Teresa Marto. She says the analysis of NDCs revealing the near absence of focus on meat and dairy is fascinating and important, given that much of this likely reflects corporate interference in policy making. What system level changes might be put in place to prevent that? And it calls to mind the finding the other day that the fossil fuel lobby had one of the largest, in aggregate delegations at the. So thinking of the food lobbyists, how could that be prevented? Do you think it's an important factor?
Yeah, and another really good question. And I think it's an incredibly important factor. And I think it's part of that vicious cycle of inaction, because I think that governments are slightly wary of the power of the agricultural industry, and they do, that they wield a lot of power. And I suppose it comes back to how we change it to the virtual cycle of action, and that I think the state has to take control, and we have to regulate the agricultural sector. They have to be seen not as legitimate actors in the climate conversation. Years ago, oil and gas used to pipe up at conversations about climate, but have you noticed they're slightly not as in the legitimate sphere when they're talking about climate as they used to be, and we need to do the same with agriculture. The agricultural lobby groups, we just need to are they legitimate actors if they're the ones causing the problem? And we need the scientists and we need the MPs to be speaking up for change. So it's, I think the state's got to get more involved with this, regulate.
There's the next question, which is close to my interest, I must say, and it's really for both of you, but I'll put it to you first, Tara. It's about, so it's from someone called Natasha Grist. She says, it's quite long, but I'll read it out. My observation and question to Paula and Tara is this: relating to UK NDC submissions, we've seen the 2020 Committee on Climate Change recommendations clearly advocating a change to meat and dairy production consumption patterns, and the July 2021 Independent National Food Strategy proposing a three-pronged approach, nudging, making alternatives cheaper, finding ways for the government supermarkets to help us. So again, advocating a till. But then you fast forward to the Net Zero Build Back Better Greener strategy, which is actually a strategy published in October 21, and we see no mention of diet, instead a huge rowing back, literally zero mentions of meat in this policy. Instead, there's a focus on emissions reduction and agricultural innovation. Why do you think this is? And what policy influence has been missed here, and what is there to be done to change this in the next 12 months and align and coordinate these two policies? So this is really about policy incoherence. Assuming that we agree that we should be tilting away from livestock, there's this kind of glaring incoherence among policies. What to do about that? Tara, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paula's little cycle of inaction is probably the diagram that you showed pretty much sums up why that is. I think there's a lot of policy hesitancy to actually focus on anything to do behavior, and we see this. It's not just food. It's also transport. The idea of getting people away from their kind of dependence on cars or on aviation or whatever. It is this absolute morbid fear of voter displeasure, and I think that's part of it. And I think it's a failure. It's a failure of the imagination, and I think it is also kind of the vested interests that we have to kind of prop up the economy with the only way we know how, and I think that's the National Food Strategy was. And the CCC report are not government reports; they are independent reports, and I don't think this government is willing to rock the boat. And I think there was a report that came out just recently. I was it was reported on in the Guardian about, the average, it was consumer people's surveys of things, and everyone thought they were a bit greener than everyone else and doing their bit a bit more than anyone else, and the things that they thought basically they were not keen to do it, the things that actually would make the difference. They're fine about recycling their plastic bags, and they're going to leave it at that. So I think it is difficult, but at the same time, no one's really made the effort to get people behind a more visionary approach to change. And so it feeds itself, as Paula points out.
Yeah, and just, totally agree with that, Tara. And I suppose where is the point of action for people who want to see more policies directing us to reducing meat? And the National Food Strategy was an independent report, and the government will be writing a white paper and responding to that, and to be published January 2022. So talk to your MP, say we need to include, if we're serious about reaching net zero by 2050, which is in law in this country, if we're serious about reaching the pledges that they've talked about in COP this week, in the last couple of weeks, then we need to include diet. Talk to your MP. We need to get this changed and ensure that gets included in the white paper. So yeah, we have to start acting and getting, because I think also that I did see a UK government poll which said that 75% of people supported or did not oppose the ability of the possibility of a meat tax. So, but the government saying, oh no, people don't like it. So, I think people have to start to voice their no, we need this, we need that. People are saying we need the government to show us what is the environmentally friendly food, make it accessible, affordable, and good for us in terms of our nutrition. So yeah, we need to act, individuals as well.
And I think, just to interrupt one thing, just to drum in the point that less doesn't mean none. Again, I think people jump from the idea that we need to shift our consumption to somehow that we need to live off, I don't know, dry Weetabix, and there's a bit more to life than that.
I've said a lot of the questions in the question thread are asking for your comments on the less and better agenda broadly, and whether you think, but just to park that briefly, we'll come back maybe to that in a minute. I've got such a lovely question here I want to put to Tara from Ivan Kent. You might not be able to answer this, Tara, but he says, which individuals or organizations would Table really like to put in a locked room to really listen to each other and build a better understanding in critical food and environment debate?
Oh God, that's a very, very difficult question. Am I allowed, like, the WTO?
Which are the bitterest oppositions?
Yeah. I'm going to narrow that down to focus on livestock to start with. I think I would like to have one of the big beef commodity producers. And I think I would like to have, oh God, this is a really, really difficult question. I think, at one level, it might be better to have the sort of the little players with different perspectives sitting around the room, because in fact, if you're in a big organization, you're going to kind of spout the party line. But when you get people together as individuals from these individual organizations, big, beef producers, philosophers, food system activists, food sovereignty activists, vegans, whatever it might be, then to try and identify points of commonality, that might be a better approach than actually bringing in official organizations. But I think I would definitely need to think more about that question, because I haven't given a good answer.
It might be, it sounds like quite an interesting paper, Tara, to evolve to, where are the fault lines? So here's a question from Paula from Eleanor Boyd. Well, it's really a bit of information. It's interesting. So she says, Paula, thank you for focusing on the key environmental issue of livestock meat and dairy. Nearly everybody in the chat thinks that's the biggest issue. This past week, the City Council in Vancouver, Canada, voted unanimously to replace 20% of meat with completely plant-based foods in schools, parks, low-cost meal programs, and events. And she says cities may be in a better position to make changes than national governments, which are more vulnerable to meat lobbies. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I mean, that is one of the key levers is procurement policies. So, that's a lever that we can use to encourage people. The amount of money that's spent on public procurement and food in countries is huge. You've got schools, you've got prisons, you've got hospitals. So it's a big amount of money that could influence the way people eat and what they eat. So I'm delighted to hear that about Vancouver. And I think that, that's an excellent way of spending public money to change behaviours for people to get used and encouraged by eating more plant-based food, and then they'll go home, possibly cook more plant-based food, talk to their friends about it. So it's just that, continuing cycle. So yes, so to answer your question, yes, I think cities and cities can play a big role in that with procurement policies.
Rosie Maunder says, Tara, I'd like to ask, are there any countries in the world where you can see evidence of effective, sustainable, just climate and food policies emerging?
No, I mean, I think there's experimentation happening all over the world. I think that's the other thing that often we talk about best practice, but I don't know how you define best practice as opposed to kind of interesting practice. I'm just thinking of, I don't know, the Brazilian nutritional guidelines, for example, which are an example of just a very different approach to thinking about food and its role, and that take a much less sort of nutrient or even food-based approach, and more about the kind of the social context of consumption. Whether that has led to actual change in I don't know, but I mean, so I think a lot of things are good ideas, and whether there's actually any kind of longitudinal research that actually tracks impacts is another. You see a lot of case studies, but impacts are harder to gauge.
So here's a more general and more topical question for both of you. How do you think the COP negotiations are going? Have they given you hope, or have they filled you with despair? Paula, you start.
Well, yeah, so I suppose going into COP and looking sort of from my vantage point, I think they missed a colossal opportunity to bring diet in to ensure that we get to our goals. But I suppose the thing about COP, before I get onto how I feel about it, is that it's actually how the agenda is set is very important, and what gets discussed and what doesn't. And it's been really interesting looking at the agenda of the 2 weeks. So, finance has had a whole day, energy had its own day, and I think today's about transport, but there was no dedicated day to agriculture, and not all food systems. Agriculture was included on the Nature Day, I think on Saturday, but to miss that as a key negotiation is again, that's a missed opportunity. But in terms of how it's going, just briefly, we had some positive announcements last week about deforestation, but we have also heard that in terms of the current commitments and pledges, it doesn't look like we're going to achieve the 1.5. So I'll reserve judgment until final pledges have been made, but can I just say that international pledges, I'm sure the listeners are aware of this, but international pledges are one thing, but for those interested in this climate discussion, watch what happens afterwards and watch what happens in national climate plans, because the devil is in the detail. Countries can pledge on an international stage like as much as they like, but what it comes down to their action plans when they go back to their countries. So, that's something to watch about the actual, how they're going to deliver on this. Is it going to become part of their climate change legislation? How are they going to deliver on these commitments is really critical.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think the only other thing to add is that, it's also very hard to get a sense of how things are going because of the framing of organizations who are observing and also reporting. So, on the one hand, you have a lot of puff and bombast of, look what we've achieved, look at this wonderful target. And on the other hand, you have a lot of, this is not good enough, this is really rubbish, you're failing. So I think we need to see, what if any rabbit they're going to pull out of a hat at the last minute, and then what's going to happen afterwards. It's actions, isn't it, as Paula said.
Paula, can I put my unfair question to you? How do you cope with this thing that now has a name, which is called eco-grief, which is the grief you feel when you realize that what you're researching isn't theoretical, it's actually very frightening?
Oh gosh, yeah, an interesting question. But I loved what Tara said earlier. I think the power of people to change things is extraordinary. And at certain times in the history of this world, people have made change happen, and you have to believe it. You have to believe it every day you get up. And there are extraordinary people working in the climate space, absolutely amazing. And yeah, so I think, we just have to believe in the power of people.
Okay. Here's a big question for Tara from Andrea. Do you think that some of the discourse in the debate, some of the uncertainty, is to distract us from taking action?
Oh, well, probably. I think that's, I wouldn't say, whether it's deliberate, I don't know. I think that's possibly a conspiracy, that could be a conspiracy theory approach to it. But I do think that the debate is preventing action. At the same time, I think there's a balance to be struck between debate and complete inertia as a result of never being able to agree. I think we need debate. We absolutely need debate. If we all said, right, let's go right, and we all go off in one direction without thinking, I think that would be terribly dangerous. But I think yes, there is a lot of I think the media can be very, very damaging in this, in kicking up polarizations where they don't exist, in sort of their provocative use of kind of headlines and so on and so forth. And I think they like to have these goodies and baddies, and I think it really, really doesn't help. Whether it's actually deliberate is, I don't think I'd go quite so far as to say that, but I could be wrong.
We're running close to the end of time, but there's an interesting question here from Vivisa that I'd like to put to both of you. Thanks to you both for very insightful presentations. What are your thoughts about how food activism can be used in constructive ways to confront the power differentials that are contributing to policy inertia among governments, businesses, and civil society? And how can we use deliberative democracy and protest politics as ways to promote social change that will move towards food systems transformation? So you partly answered that, but can I ask you both for your thoughts on that in 1.5 minutes each?
Okay. I'll go first. I'll be very quick. So one thing is, I think activism has there are different sort of angles to activism. One is kind of protest and anger, and I think that's really, really important. But I think there's also kind of constructive activism as well, which is about positive visions and positive examples and practices. I think that's the other angle. I would say that I think activism about food, probably the biggest thing that it could do at the moment is also be more inclusive, because I think it is still very much, I guess, sort of culturally and racially and homogeneous still. So I think expanding its constituency and its membership to be more representative of, well, I'm talking about the UK here, would be important. I think there's signs, slow signs that this is happening, but I think that could be one very positive and necessary thing to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I suppose, you know, also just this idea that, you know, food is everywhere, and it's on television, we eat, we consume, we have family gatherings, you know, food is an intensely personal thing, but it's also a political thing. And I think we need to kind of raise that up more. We need to discuss it more. We need to have it, as Tara was saying, open debates about it. The food that you eat is the most political decision you make each day in some respects. So we need food activism is really critical for that change to happen. But we need to have debates. We need community debates. We need to be inclusive debates, and we need to bring our MPs into those debates. We need it as a national conversation. We like watching cooking shows. I love the Bake Off, but you know, we don't actually talk about the food that goes into those in the Bake Off. It was a big hoo-ha because they had a vegan thing last night. So, you know, like let's talk about these ingredients and where they come from and what they mean, and supply chains, etc. So yeah, we need more open conversations about food.
And when you do have these open conversations, people are interested and they're engaged and they're thoughtful, and I think that's really positive.
That's a good note to end on. We've reached the end of our time. We've had a lot of questions that we have not been able to answer, and I apologize to people who have asked questions that we haven't answered. Thank you for asking them. I think we'll all go away very thoughtfully and both watch the news about COP and eat whatever we're going to eat for our dinner with a more, perhaps a different mind. I'd like to thank Tara Garnett and Paula Feehan for being wonderful contributors and panelists this evening. I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us. I hope you'll join us again next time on December the 8th. And don't forget, if you'd like to read Paula's blog, that will come out via the Food Research Collaborations blog post tomorrow. Thank you and good night.
Night.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.